Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I believe most people here are journalists, so good afternoon, colleagues. You know when you're in a lecture hall and the lecturer says, today everyone's going to talk, and they get to you, you're probably the last person in the class, and you say, well, everybody's already said what I had to say, or this person already gave my answer. I think that's what he did. He said literally everything, but I'm still going to add to what he said. And I'm going to keep mine brief so it balances. Why are we discussing press freedom here today? And I'll give a few practical examples. Just last week, one of my colleagues, his name is Stanley Niblo, he went into Accra Central to cover a story about sanitation. Now, this was on the back of certain pronouncements by the Minister of Sanitation, claiming that they had achieved some 85% of the drive to make Accra the cleanest city in Africa. What happened to Stanley? Stanley was simply taking pictures of a cleanup exercise. There was a soldier over there who asked the policeman to arrest him. For whatever reason, the policeman in good conscience declined because Stanley had done nothing wrong. This soldier decides to take the matter into his own hands. Manhandles Stanley, in fact beats him up, damages his phone, damages his camera. Stanley has to follow them to the AMA trying to retrieve these items, only to be further beaten at the AMA. In fact, he was beaten in the reception area. And this is how impudent the system is in brutalizing journalists. What has happened to this particular policeman, well, the particular soldier? So far, there has been no sanction. So is there any impunity for crimes against journalists in Ghana? I still will give you more examples, and then you decide that for yourself. So I'm not going to come here and tell you we have a situation where there's impunity for crimes against journalists. No. In 2015, there was a radio reporter called George Abanga, and he worked with Success FM in the Western region. He was shot dead. And he was shot dead when he was returning from reporting on a story about cocoa farming disputes. At the same time, George had also been reporting on some regional political tensions. In March 2018, Latif Idrisu was dragged into the CID. Where will you go for protection? He was dragged and beaten by policemen at the CID headquarters. Nothing happened to them. And his only crime was for asking questions while reporting. Let's move to January 2019, the very infamous case of Ahmed Swale. Prior to the murder of Ahmed had spoken out about his fears for his life. He feared that his life was in danger because we all know the very popular Member of Parliament, Kennedy Japon, had put his image on TV, literally inciting his fans, his supporters, whoever is listening, to harm Ahmed. If you put my image on TV and incite the public to harm me, I will feel threatened. So his life was literally in danger. Nothing was done about it. Ahmed is dead, who is the culprit. Ghana's parliament has been embarrassingly silent on these incidences. This is the same parliament that in 2018, when Khashoggi was murdered, actually found in itself the temerity to question the circumstances surrounding Khashoggi's death, and even encourage the Saudi government to institute an independent investigation. This is Ghana's parliament. I don't know what message Parliament is trying to give the journalists in this country, because I have not at any point heard them speak up against any brutality meted out to any journalist in Ghana. So what is Parliament trying to tell us? You're ignoring the atrocities in your backyard, but you're calling on foreign governments to investigate the atrocities that they commit. And do not forget that the murder of journalists do not happen in a vacuum. They're not random incidences. It is a build-up. You slap a journalist, nobody does anything about it. You beat a journalist, nobody does anything about it. Gradually, you're instituting a culture of violence against journalists. And once everyone who does this goes free, what do you tell the people? It's okay to assault journalists. And so, of course, you will find more and more incidences of abuse against journalists. I'm going to also use this opportunity to call upon Information Minister Nkrumah, who has been a journalist himself. And so I am encouraging him to be more active in denouncing the abuses of local journalists. He hears about them, he's the Information Minister, and knows everything. I encourage him to be vocal about denouncing these issues. We've also heard about the very famous Hajia Fati slap, which Ohima Sechiwa had to endure when she went to the MPP headquarters to report on the story. She was taking pictures that they did not want her to take. Hajia Fati decided to slap her. What was her excuse? She said the girl looked like an onion seller to her. But let's assume she was actually an onion seller. What if she was just some random hawker off the streets who came by the MPP headquarters to take some pictures? Isn't she a citizen of Ghana? Why do you have to slap her? Even if her station in life is lower, does that mean it's okay to abuse people who are of lower stations in life than you are? But this was one of the few incidences that I was actually proud of the journalist, because she pursued the case all the way through court, and eventually she was awarded some 9,000 Ghana cedis. So it's not a landmark judgment, but there's a bit of deterrent. So again, I want to ask you, what is the state of press freedom in Ghana? And just as I have narrated, that is exactly the state of press freedom. I was also going to mention some incidences and violations and attacks, but Mr. Suleiman already mentioned those. There were some figures between 2017 and 2019 alone. We had about 31 incidences of attacks. There were a lot of violations. About 41 journalists. I think the figure has increased down to some 60-something. And I'll go back to 2013 and we'll look at our position on the index, which is usually compiled by Reporters Without Borders. So in 2013, Ghana scored was 30th position out of 180. In 2014, 27, in 2015, one of our good years, in fact, 2015 was the best year for us on the index, which was 22nd out of 180. 2016, we went down to 26. 2017, we went down, we remained at 26. And then in 2018, we were 23rd, in 2019, 27th, I think 2020, 30th position. So our best performances were 2013, 2015, thereabouts, and 2020 looking good, quite good. So let's note that although in ranking very high in Africa, when you take the African context, you might find that Ghana is ranking quite better than other countries, but it does not necessarily make us the beacon of press freedom. It's like when you are the one-eyed man, you know. Our guiding principle should be the chapter 12 of the 1992 Constitution, which guarantees media pluralism and independence. Unfortunately, one of the issues we have is that almost a third of media houses in Ghana are owned by politicians and businessmen, some of whom are usually linked to the government of the day. This, of course, poses a conflict of interest. Because you will not exactly have the power to restrict media ownership, but how do you censor yourself and how do you maintain some objectivity? So at this point, I also call on media houses in Ghana to train their journalists with relevant skills. Pay them decent pay. And this is part of the economic environment that fosters abuse of journalists. I see someone clapping. So pay journalists decent pay, because journalists are some of the lowest paid professionals in Ghana. And if you consider journalists professionals and hold them to a high standard and expect them to deliver, then you have to be paying them decently. And I'll share a very interesting story, which I shared with him earlier in the day. There was a time I found out one of my colleagues had been fired from work. And I was very concerned because this is a young man who was very hardworking. He was my senior by far. And he contributed heavily to my department. He was a subject expert. It was going to be difficult without him because we would have to take on what we didn't know. So I decided to ask more questions. Why was he fired? And I found out that he was soliciting for Solly. What happened is, on more than one occasion, he had been to an event and he had asked the event organizers to give him some money. And this had happened more than once, more than twice. Unfortunately for him, the incident that got him sacked, he had confronted the organizers, asked them to give him money, and one of them knew some of our managers, so they called to report him, and he was sacked. I said, okay, fair enough. You know, he clearly made a huge mistake. He should never have gone to solicit for any money from any organizer. But then later I found out his salary, his take home was 800 cedis. And this young man I mentioned is by far my senior. He had a wife and 3 children at home, and he was being paid 800 cedis a month. So beyond the ethical misconduct, you realize that this man was just trying to survive. So if you're paying a man 800 cedis, or paying a full-grown woman 800 cedis a month, the person is going to start looking for corners to survive. And how do you do that? When you start looking for corners to survive, trying to, become economically buoyant, you involve yourself in some malpractices, and that makes you vulnerable. At that point, you're compromised. You cannot be really reliable. But when you sack someone like that, yes, he's gone. But you have to go back and sit down and question yourself. How logical is it to pay a man who is obviously very good at his job 800 cedis a month and expect him not to become a criminal in the discharge of his duties? One of the other major threats to journalists in Ghana I consider rogue politicians, and these are people who make seriously criminal allegations against journalists and media houses. And there are some media houses who should know better, but they allow these politicians to sit on their platforms and make these pronouncements, and they even go further to publish it. And I already mentioned earlier, one of such politicians is Kennedy Japon. And these are journalists who have put in so much, whose lives are in danger, who try to defend truth for this country. And what do they get? They end up being threatened, they end up being heckled, end up being targeted by foot soldiers and fans of these politicians. One of my colleagues, Friedrich, has gone through this a few years ago when he dared to consistently question the competence of the former sanitation minister. We have so many practical examples of these recorded against Anas, Arimia Anas. In fact, just Tuesday, August 11, Adom FM published an apology for allegations that suggested he was a criminal who engages in illegal mining. And we remember these allegations. We need to start questioning the motives of so-called leaders and politicians who make it their daily business to whip up public arms against journalists. What do you have to hide? So much that you want the public to hate journalists. Today we are at a point where journalists are questioned for every move and everything they say. You hear people telling you this is supposed to ensure that journalists are more accountable. I agree to that. Journalists are supposed to be accountable and objective and unbiased. But I ask you, who is supposed to be more accountable to you, the journalist or the politician? Who do your taxes pay? And who did you put in office? So yes, although journalists owe the public a lot of truth and objectivity, we must tell our stories without bias and we must avoid personal interest. But we have a situation where you hold the journalists accountable over the politician. When you begin to do that, there is clearly a problem. Again, I will make mention of the Minister of Information, Kojo Opong Nkrumah, because in 2019, I remember he said there had been an approval of a financial component for the implementation of a coordinated mechanism to protect journalists in Ghana. This was during the last celebration of the day to mark impunity against journalists. He actually promised that this would be outdoored after the 2020 budget reading, sometime around that. I have not heard about that anymore. I don't know about you. If anyone has more information, please let me know. But again, I would like to encourage him to follow through with that particular promise. Although delayed, it's still very welcome. The benefits can still greatly benefit journalists, and it will also demonstrate actual political will to fight these infractions against journalists. And let me quickly sum up by saying that in times of trauma targeted at one section of society, if you remain silent because it does not directly affect you, you're making a mistake. I don't know what people are waiting for before the abuse of journalists gets their attention. If you're a journalist and it doesn't get your attention, it's worrying. If you're a regular citizen who's not a journalist, you still have to be worried. But what do we wait for? Are we waiting to get to a point where suppression of journalists becomes seemingly institutionalized? Because that's where we're headed. If you keep ignoring crimes against journalists, if there's no prosecution of crimes against journalists, then eventually you're going to get to a situation where it becomes normal. A threat to press freedom is a threat to democracy. And so, even your silence is violence. Your silence, your inability to speak up about the issues that confront journalists, and the fact that people keep going free for abusing journalists is part of the violence. And again, I would say the very low pay that journalists have to take home at the end of the month is even a bigger form of violence against journalists. Thank you so much.